Welcome to On Point with Ron Gailey, where we meet with city leaders to discuss pressing issues, best practices, and ways that citizens and leaders come together to build their communities. City and municipal leaders have some of the toughest jobs in America. They are bombarded by expectations and conflicting demands. This podcast explores how successful leaders navigate that complexity. And now, your host, CEO and founder of On Point Insights, Ron Gailey.
Hey, we'll get started.
Okay.
Hey, Ryan, good to have you here today.
Yep.
How are things in Ohio?
They're going good. I'm excited for another podcast.
We're glad to have Norton Bonaparte with us today. Thank you for joining us, Norton.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking, Ron.
Yeah. Well, Norton and I met in Florida. I was there for a conference with city leaders, and we struck up a conversation while we were on a bus ride. we were captive for quite a bit of time, and I rather enjoyed getting to know a very wonderful and thoughtful man. So I asked him if he would be willing to join us for our podcast today, and thank you. I'm glad you would join us.
Well, you're very kind, Ron, and very very kind. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Norton is the chief, he's a city manager of Sanford, Florida. And he's been there since September 2011. And there he's the chief administrative officer of the city and manages a budget of nearly $3 million and over 500 people. So he has
300 million.
For 300 million,
yeah.
and over 500 employees.
Yes.
Yeah. So not a small budget at all, and not a small city, really, and a meaningful city. So I'm glad you'd join us. Prior to Sanford, he was a city manager of 5 other cities, including Topeka, Kansas, and Camden, New Jersey. So he's got some really good experience. He brings a lot. All righty. Well, so anyway, occasionally a city manager will face a challenge that even the best leaders will find stretching. And when Norton had been city manager for just 5 months, really not very long, an event happened in Sanford that caused a big issue. Trayvon Martin was killed in his city. And from that point on, Norton and the other city leaders had some challenges to deal with, and they had to figure out how to do it quickly because it was upon them. And so we'll discuss the Trayvon Martin issue briefly, but that's not where we're going to spend most of our time. Where we're going to spend most of our time is on lessons learned and where do we go from here, and how can another city be thoughtfully prepared for an event that maybe is unexpected on their end. And so that's where we're going. That's what we'll be talking about, and I sure appreciate that. So Norton, just as we begin, tell us a little bit about Sanford, Florida.
Sure. Sanford, Florida is right north of Orlando, population approaching 65,000. As you indicated, we have over 540 city employees. We do a full service city, including utilities. We have a lot of recreation areas, a lot of parks, and it is really enjoying Central Florida in the weather. We're not too far from beaches, so we're finding a large increase in the number of people that want to live in our community.
Very good, very good. And then Trayvon Martin was killed. Many listeners will have just a superficial knowledge of that. Would you mind giving us a little overview and bring us up to speed?
Sure. It was February 24th of 2012, as you were saying, around 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening, that I got a call from our police chief indicating that there had been a shooting resulting in the death of a young African-American male. They didn't have any identification, so they couldn't say what his name was, and that they had the person that did the shooting in custody. He was saying that it was in self-defense. I would love to tell you that we don't have that situation often, but we do have times where young African-American males are shot and killed in the city of Sanford. So it was not in and of itself outstanding. It was just a very unfortunate situation. It wasn't until the following day that a resident indicated that their son had not come home the following night. And when we identified the body and showed the father, he did say that it was his son, Trayvon Martin. So that was Tracy Martin that had the unfortunate situation of having to identify the body of his son. It was almost 2 weeks before there's really any media. But then after a while, we started getting inquiries from the local media, from the Orlando area, and then we got from the national. We got from CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and then we started getting from BBC, the British newspaper. We got from Russia, Germany. It became an international story. I have an aunt, my deceased father's sister, who called, and she said she saw me on TV because at that time we were starting to do interviews. And she said, "How am I doing?" But she had seen me on TV and she was just checking in. Well, she lives in Trinidad. So I was giving you an idea of the magnitude of how this has become an international story. The challenge that we faced is that it was not a police shooting, but it was a shooting by a resident who had recently formed a neighborhood watch group, and the group had made him the chairman. And so the question is, well, why did he have the authority to shoot? He did call the police. As a matter of fact, he called the police non-emergency number when he saw Trayvon walking in his neighborhood. George Zimmerman knew the non-emergency number because he called it all the time. Anytime he saw somebody suspicious, he knew to call not the 911 number, but the police non-emergency number. And he called that number that night. There was the confrontation. We only, unfortunately, have one side of that confrontation, and that's from George Zimmerman. But it was result in the death of Trayvon Martin.
Amazing, amazing. And so, how did it affect your team as you
We
began?
then started getting inquiries, not just from the media, but we got a call. Our office got a call from the Reverend Al Sharpton's office, indicating that he and 30,000 of his best friends were going to come that weekend to march in Sanford in protest. As I indicated, it was not a police shooting, so it was not a Sanford police officer who did the shooting, it was individual. But there was a public perception that the Sanford police were not handling the situation correctly. One of the challenges was the media portrayal of both George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, in my opinion. The
Right,
pictures you would see in the media of George Zimmerman were that of a kind of a husky gentleman that actually was in jail outfit. And the pictures that were proposed for Trayvon Martin looked like a 12-year-old.
right. I remember that.
Jersey. Well, Trayvon Martin was about to turn 18. So those are the pictures that were the public. And when the public looked at that, and some said, Mr. Bonaparte, you see those pictures, and your police tell me that George Zimmerman fired in self-defense because this little boy was so menacing, and your police department bought it. You know, your officers believed him. Well, Trayvon Martin was taller than George Zimmerman at the time. He was 17, not the 12 or 13-year-old picture. And I actually questioned the media about that. And they said, well, Mr. Bonaparte, that's the picture we had. So that's
Right,
what we used. But you'll see other pictures of Trayvon that you could see that he was, 17, he was taller than George Zimmerman. But beside the fact that they got into a scuffle that resulted in the tragic death of Trayvon. But the public saw that this seemed to be where as I was told, the Sanford police had botched the investigation. So the people wanted to come and protest in Sanford about how the police were handling it. We had one rally that we particularly partnered with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office so that the main presence of law enforcement was not Sanford police officers, because people were coming angry at the Sanford police, but the Seminole County Sheriff's Office. The Sanford police have blue uniforms. Seminole County Sheriff's offices have green uniforms. And with the situation again with Al Sharpton, with 30,000 people here, we had to make sure for their safety as well as for others, so there was a proper law enforcement presence. And so what people saw were the green uniforms of the Seminole County Sheriff's Office and not blue uniforms of the Sanford police. I will tell you that there were a lot of Sanford police at that event, just
sure.
not in their blue uniforms.
Right,
Because again, if anything happens, we need to make sure we're protecting the public safety, those that came to protest as well as the residents of the city of Sanford. That was
fascinating.
one event. We had another event where we were told that Trayvon's parents Sabrina, and Colton and Tracy Martin were going to come to a city commission meeting with a petition signed by 1 million people for the arrest of George Zimmerman. I'm not sure about other cities, but one of the powers that the City Commission of Sanford does not have is issuing an arrest warrant. But they came, and they also had Jesse Jackson with them. I share about this because when we got information that there's about 3,000 people coming to the City Commission meeting, our City Commission chambers holds about 150 people. So some quick math says if 3,000 people are coming to a room that has 150 capacity, you need to make some changes. So what we did is we pivoted, as we said during COVID. We went to the City Civic Center, which has a capacity much higher than that, of about 150,000. About 300 people. Assuming it was about 600 people could go. But what we also did, again, if you do math, 3,000 minus 6 means a whole lot of people still not getting in. So we rented jumbotrons, and we had right outside of the facility where people that couldn't get in could at least hear and see what was happening inside. We actually had some United States congresspersons at that meeting, in addition to Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. And they had the opportunity to speak and to share their concerns. And so we heard it. We took the approach that we were having visitors and guests. We even had water stations. We also had porta potties. The reality is we knew we should be prepared.
Right.
All of that cost about $25,000. Now, that wasn't budgeted, but I didn't consider it an expense. I considered it an investment in public safety.
No, preservation, right?
You can imagine if something went wrong or whatever, if those people stayed as angry as they were. So we had some city staff even greeting buses as they came and handing out water. We treated them as guests. We had some visitors, although they were coming not for a happy reason, but they were coming and we wanted to let them know. Again, George Zimmerman was not a city employee. It was not a police shooting, but people were coming to Sanford. We even had one individual on the radio talk about go to Sanford and tear the city down. And that was on a national radio station. People were very angry. I also say, Ron, that was in February. And then he was shot in February, and then the rallies took place in March and April. I was reading the Wall Street Journal in April, and I saw that up to that day, and this was in 2012, there had been over 423 murders, shootings in the city of Chicago.
Right.
What made this one shooting in a small southern Florida city so internationally renowned? A lot of from the city perspective, people that had never heard of Sanford now only heard of Sanford as the place that Trayvon Martin was killed. So we had to do a lot of public relations and getting information out about come see us for yourself.
It's hard to wrap your mind around how that one event became so big, and yet it did. And I guess what that tells you is any city could have an event happen that seems small at the time, but the rain clouds come and the storm descends, right? And then you have to deal with it. And I don't know, did you feel prepared at all for it?
I don't know how you can be prepared. There's nothing that they teach you in city management school about that. We certainly had some lessons learned. I have a friend who's a city manager in Florida, and he was the city manager of Gainesville at the time when a pastor of a very, very, very small church indicated that he was going to publicly burn the Quran. That got international attention on that.
Sure.
And so that city had to deal with that. So the point that you're making, Ron, is that things can happen that will just affect you that have nothing to do with city operations. But now the city has to respond, and the city has to take action to address the concerns that people are dealing with.
And sure, and social media makes it so that anyone anywhere can cause an incident, can set off something that can become an incident.
Correct. And
right.
We had even situations where the media miscommunicated things. For instance, one of the statements that some media was saying is that the city of Sanford did not take away George Zimmerman's gun permit and that he could be walking around with another gun because we had confiscated the one he did the shooting. Well, I suspect that a number of people may understand why the city of Sanford could not revoke George Zimmerman's state-issued concealed carry permit. We just can't. I mean, that's a state issue,
It's
not
a
a
state
city issue.
issued thing, right?
Right.
Right.
But the media was saying that we were stupid because we didn't take his gun permit.
Right.
So
Right.
the idea again is not so much what happened to us, but what we learned. And so we have had the opportunity to share the importance of being prepared for what you're not prepared for.
Do you know,
So
I
could
think that is the right direction to go. Let's talk about that. Ryan, you go ahead.
Yeah, so right along with that, I would love to dive deeper into what changes you've made in terms of policy and outreach that would help prepare Sanford for something similar or any other distressing events that could occur and what other cities could learn from it. Um, so I guess we could start with community outreach. Let's go with that first.
Ryan, excellent. And I'm glad you pointed that. One of the things I've shared when I've talked about this with other city managers is the importance of building partnerships with community organizations and community groups prior to needing it. We had a good relationship with the Urban League, and so we got in with them. But I would encourage people, whether it's the NAACP, a Hispanic organization, LGBTQ organization, to know who the leaders are so that when you call them, if something happens, and you call them, they're saying that you have already built a relationship with them. There's a local NAACP chapter, and when they have their annual banquet, the mayor, the police chief, and our command staff would always make a point to attend. And it wasn't because we were hungry and needed a place to have dinner. It was building relationships before you need them so that when you do call on them, they know who you are. And finding out who the leaders are, not just who the head of an organization is, but who the community leaders are. You know, if something happens in your gay community, know who the LGBTQ leaders are so that you can go to them so that they can then talk. One of the things we did with the Department of Justice is we allowed local pastors to sit in on the trial of George Zimmerman so that when they're meeting with the church at their church services and they were talking to their pedestrians, they can tell exactly what was taking place, not what they heard somebody say was taking place, but they had actually been in the courtroom. So we immediately got with the clergy, especially with the black clergy, to see that because there are people that will listen to their clergy rather than they'll listen to someone from City Hall.
You know, I love how you do that. And it sounds like you're mixing together all kinds of groups. Like it doesn't matter which group it is, right? It could be the
Mhm.
NAACP, it could be the Spanish, it could be the
Muslim,
LGBTQ, it could be religious groups.
yeah.
Like they're all from all walks of life, and you consider them all a potential asset in
Mhm.
the face of a storm because you've built a relationship.
And I've talked about when I was in Kansas, we had emergency management operations for tornadoes.
Right.
In Florida, we have them for hurricanes. I've stressed to city managers the importance of having them for social unrest. Now, certainly, we've seen within the last couple of years situations happen that are social, and you have people marching in the streets. You saw what happened with Ferguson when, in my opinion, the very military response that people saw, I think, agitated the situation
Right.
to the not a positive outcome.
Right.
So it's important that you be prepared, that you have communications and relationship with all the various segments of your community prior to needing to call on them, so that if you do have a situation, they know who you are. You knew what numbers to call. You don't have to now figure out, well, who should I call that can relate to this community? Who will I be able to call that can talk to this community to be a conduit for information that we can then establish some dialogue with?
So this is like 12 years later now, and you still have those relationships in place, right?
So we continue to work on them because something can happen anytime. You know, again, within the past couple of years throughout the country, you've seen situations from George Floyd to Ferguson to Baltimore where things just happen. So it is important to maintain the relationships. And plus, it's just good. You know, we're a city of a diverse population. And it's important that all of the residents feel that they have a say and that they can have a connection to the city of Sanford. One of the challenges with the shooting of Trayvon Martin that had nothing to do with Trayvon was the racial history of Sanford. Sanford is a southern town. Back when there was a city of Georgetown formed, it was it's the second black city formed in the state of Florida. Well, at that time, it was adjacent to the city of Sanford, and the city leaders decided that they wanted to grow. So they went to the Florida State Legislature and had that city disbanded. And then they took it over, they annexed it, and did things like change the name of the street that was in the honor of the black mayor to the name of the new white mayor. And so
Oh,
they did that in the city. And
oh
there's people
no.
that still remember that and have very strong feelings about that. Back in the early civil rights times, when the city was told they had to desegregate its swimming pool, rather than desegregate it, they tore down the pool. So it wasn't being segregated. And then
Right.
some of you may have seen the movie 42, when the Brooklyn Dodgers had the summer camp and it was in Sanford, and Jackie Robinson came and he went on the field. And at that time, the Sanford police chief went on the field and told them to take that person off the field. So that's the history that Sanford has. And so
Right.
then when you take the Trayvon Martin shooting, where it's perceived that had Trayvon Martin been white, George Zimmerman would have been treated very differently if he was black, which, by the way, knowing the police chief at the time as I do, he would not. It would have been the same. Billy Lee, as the police chief, was very fair and treated Trayvon Martin's death as he would if Trayvon Martin were white or anything else, as
Right.
well as George Zimmerman if he were black. Some people said it was prejudice that if George Zimmerman were black, he'd have been put under the jail, never mind being able to leave the police headquarters that night. But people viewed it as a racial issue, and some of that had to do with some of Sanford's history. And also, I think one of the key points to why it became an international situation, and this, in my opinion, is it appears as if a white person were to shoot and kill a black person and nothing happened again.
Correct. I think that's exactly what it is, and it was the accumulation effect, right?
Mhm.
And then people just couldn't do it.
I think that was part of it. That people just felt that this was just another example, and people were sick and tired of it, and so they just saw this as an opportunity to say no more. And that's where the Black Lives Matters movement started. So it was really the start of something to say this type of behavior should not go on. And then, unfortunately, after that, we had George Floyd, we had the Ferguson situation, and a number of others, Baltimore, et cetera, that were police involved. Again, we were not a police involved situation, but the police were tied into it because what was perceived as lack of proper police action.
And
Yeah, it was a
speaking
lack of action.
and,
Go for it, Ryan.
and speaking of those other incidents with George Floyd and Black Lives Matters and those developments, how did that affect Sanford? And maybe how was your response to marches with Black Lives Matter different from the situation with Trayvon Martin because of your previous experiences?
Well, I can tell you that when there were individuals that identified that Sanford was the home of Black Lives Matters, particularly after George Floyd's death, they came and they marched in Sanford, the Black Lives Matters. And I
Yeah,
will tell you that our then mayor, our police chief, and I marched with them. We marched with them to show that, yes, we understand that this is important.
that's powerful.
It wasn't a political stand so much as it was a stand of simply support of people's
Correct.
feelings and opinions, right?
Correct. Yeah, we had visitors to our city that came because they wanted to express the right to protest and to march in our streets, and we had to get the police so that we can have clear access and block off streets so that there was no traffic issues. But the police chief and our command staff made a point to march with them to show we understand.
Hmm.
That's a radically different approach than many other communities took to similar events. And I think it's meaningful to choose solidarity and peace up front rather than, as you put it, maybe a more militant response that serves to escalate rather than de-escalate people's emotions.
One of the other things I would point out is that we did get a new police chief after the death of Trayvon Martin. And the first thing he did is every Thursday, he and his command staff officers would pick an area of the city and they would do what they call the knock and talk. They would
Really?
go down to streets just knocking on doors, introducing themselves, particularly in the African American community, because with
Mm.
the death of Trayvon Martin, there was a whole issue of what is the relationship between the African American community and the Sanford Police Department. And I think every police department can tell you they can't be effective without the cooperation of the community members. So it's about showing that you care. The old saying that people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And so what he was doing is getting out and saying, look, we're here. We want to introduce ourselves because we care about you.
How well did that work, do you think?
Very good. Very good. We also did some other things. We established a police community relations blue ribbon panel. It was headed by one of the local black pastors and a retired white judge. And we had community members there, and their idea was to find out how was the community relations between the community and the police department and what needs to change. And we had presentations from the prosecutor's office, from the public defender's office, from the police, and showing what training they were going under, as well as public hearings and public opportunities for residents to come and share their experiences and to learn. And the idea there, and they issued a report on recommendations for the Sanford Police Department. We had a public meeting to display what their recommendations are. And 1 year later, we had another public meeting to say how we had implemented the recommendations of that task force.
There you go.
Again, I think building the public trust to say, we heard you, and we're not going to say, isn't that great, and here's a report. But then 1 year later, we had a public meeting to say what we had done with the report.
I love it. It's so thoughtful. Yeah, I was visiting with another city leader just yesterday. I was in a meeting, and the chief of police was speaking, and we were and also the fire chief was there. I was presenting to the whole city leadership team, and the fire department just said, I just don't know that we have much of a relationship with the city after 9/11. After the COVID thing. After COVID, they just haven't been out to the schools like they used to go out to the schools. They haven't been doing a variety of things that they had once been doing before. You know what I mean? And, I think it is interesting after an event like, for example, COVID, you can kind of become insular a little bit. Like you can pull into yourself a little bit. And that's what they were saying. And they were saying, we need to get out there. We need to have more events. And I think you've shown a really good pattern of how you maybe can do it. Now they were talking fire department, but I just love the way that you're doing it, and we were talking with another city and they do National Night Out, which I don't know, you may do that in your city.
We do.
And in their city, they have like community activities all around the city.
Yeah.
And then on National Night Out, the police, the fire, the city leaders all go and visit these different community parties, which is a grand idea, I think. And it just shows, I just love the solidarity and support that city leaders can show.
Well, I wanted to share another story with you. I got a call from our finance office, particularly our purchasing office, that said, Mr. Bonaparte, I just want you to know that the police department's buying video equipment. Okay, that does sound interesting. And so I went to the chief, and it turned out that we had acquired 2 trailers, and we were putting in them video equipment. And what the officers would do is they'd go out to different parks, open up the trailers and have the video equipment, and guess all of a sudden who would surround them? Young people wanting to play the video games. And so you have an opportunity of young people interacting on the police video games, and every now and then talking to an officer without it being confrontational. And so they got to see the police in a different light. So I think that that's kind of the stage we want to set, where individuals are interacting with police officers and it's not confrontational. Another thing we did.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
No, I was going to say, we also invited the public to some of the fair and impartial police training that we had done for our officers. So we could have members of the clergy, other public leaders come in, and they could sit and hear what's being taught to the police officers in terms about being fair and impartial policing. We also got in touch with the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement, NOBLE, and were they able to come and they did some training for our African American youth at our community center on rights that people have. So it was a wake-up call to we need to be proactive with this.
I just love that. And tell me, you mentioned Noble, and I hadn't heard of them before you brought it up.
National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Officials.
And tell me more about that organization. What do they do?
Well, it's an organization of black law enforcement, and they have various training. And we invited them, and they came to Sanford, and they put on some training for African American youth.
Huh. And this was for the youth. This wasn't for the police department or anything. It was for the youth.
This was for the young people. In another city I was at, we did some training for the young people and interacting. For instance, sharing with them, if you're driving and a police car sirens and lights go on behind you, some tips. For instance, one of the tips is turn on your dome light.
Right.
So it
Right.
immediately sends a message, turn on your dome light. But, if you hadn't heard that, keep your hands where people can see them.
Right. Right. No, it's just really fascinating what you've done. And I just love the idea. Some of those kids and some of those leaders that they've gone through training and they've experienced this, somebody will say, well, they haven't done any training, or whatever they do is inadequate or whatever. But these people from experience can say, well, I actually attended, and it's
Yes.
it's quite good, as a
At
matter
least
of
to
fact.
learn what the police are being told.
Right, right. It's quite good. I'm on our city planning commission, and so I'm involved with the city leadership here, and we had an event that actually caused a big uproar in our own city. But because I interact routinely with the city leaders, I know both sides of the story,
Mhm.
and I was able to talk about that. And I just think allowing people to gain that experience, that knowledge, the understanding of what's going on, so that they can filter between the opinions and maybe what is really happening. That's big.
Yeah. We've even had civilians or citizens go through and be able to part of some of the police training that we do for new recruits.
Yeah.
Shoot, don't shoot, so they get a sense of what the police are being trained and then what it's like to go through some of those exercises.
I just think this is the coolest thing. Go ahead, Ryan. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to highlight one of the things that you've pointed out here, Norton, about all the different ways that you've got the youth to interact with the police officers in positive ways. It's good because, as you pointed out, without those interactions, the youth may never interact with a police officer unless they're getting pulled over, having some sort of negative confrontation, right? So you have to go out of your way to have those positive interactions that are meaningful. And I think that's probably important to the officers. I'm not a police officer, but I imagine, if they're spending a lot of their time doing difficult aspects of their job, they have a fair number of negative confrontations per day with residents of the city, and that can wear on them, I would imagine. And so to get these opportunities to have great positive reactions is probably really good for the morale and the perspective of police officers as well.
Well, we had one situation, and I credit the police chief because this is because of his constant telling the officers to interact with the public. We made national news when a police officer, a female police officer, responded to a call for service, and there were some young girls outside. And when she finished the call, she went back and was talking with them. And the news picked up when her partner taped her doing a dance-off. Somehow they were able to jerry-rig the police car so that they were playing music. And so you have the video of this police officer in uniform dancing with these young girls in the street. And it made national news. And that was because the police chief is stressed, where we can, let's have positive interaction.
I had never
That's
thought
good.
about that. How wonderful is that? And then, Ryan, I love your point that it's probably beneficial for the police themselves to get out there and have positive interactions with
Right.
people and know that, okay, sometimes things are negative, but also there's a great deal of positive that's happening.
Exactly. And it's not done. The most recent event that happened is I got a call from somebody that said, well, Sanford is where the Trayvon Martin was killed and the beginning of Black Lives Matter, but yet we're seeing around the country cities having Black Lives Matter painted on their streets, and we haven't heard that Sanford's doing. I'd like to come and to paint Black Lives Matter on the street in front of the police headquarters in Sanford. Well, I've asked the person, had they been to Sanford? Because the Sanford Police Headquarters is at the entrance to the African American community. So if you want to paint Black Lives Matter on that street, I think the people that live there kind of already know that Black Lives Matter. But what we did do is say, well, we also think it's important to move us forward. And so what the City Commission did, and I'm proud of that, is that they established an advisory committee, Race, Equity, Equality, and Inclusion. It's called the REAL Committee. And this is comprised of residents, and their charge is to go out into the community, have community forums, community meetings, to find out what do the citizens of Sanford think about Black Lives Matter? What do the citizens of Sanford think is the atmosphere of racial relations within the city of Sanford? And more importantly, now that they have that information, they're making a report to the city commission on their recommendations on what the city should do. They came about, one of the first recommendations is rather than just be an ad hoc committee, to be a standing committee. And city commission said, okay, so they established them as a standing committee, so they're ongoing. It's not just a temporary committee. And the next part was to continue to have these open forums. And they had them one 2 weeks ago, and they're having another one in 2 weeks, where this inviting residents to come of all walks and all stages and to be able to talk about their experiences in Sanford and what they think Sanford can do to become an even more inclusive community.
I love it. I love it. Hey, Norton, I have a question for you. You've stressed the importance of communication many times, and I'd love to know, like, if I were another city leader listening to you, what have you done with communication, like, or what would you recommend a city do to think about communication beyond maybe what they may be thinking because of the experience you've had? How do you communicate with the media? How do you communicate with citizens? How do you communicate, and what are the things you've put in place?
And what's an effective communication with the media? For instance, when Trayvon Martin happened, we had only within the last couple of weeks pointed out somebody to serve as the city's public information officer, and that was solely to be able to coordinate press releases. When this happened, we went outside and hired a public relations consultant.
Did you
to
really?
Say, yes, and I would offer that cities should at least have a call list or have a referral list of somebody that is professional in knowing how to deal with the media. In other words, it's not just taking somebody that has a bachelor's degree in journalism.
Right, that's what you're going to have in your city, right? You're going to have that.
But somebody that knows how do you deal with the media. For instance, we hired somebody who had media experience, and she was very clear to say, Mayor, you're going to do this. City manager, you do this. And she was never seen on camera, but she was behind the scenes telling us how to craft our story, how get the professionals to say how to communicate with the media in a meaningful and effective way. What is the media looking for? We first of all, in this situation, we moved having the press conferences from the police headquarters to City Hall because people were angry at the police. So they moved it from the police headquarters to City Hall. We still had them, rather than ad hoc, we then scheduled every day at this time, we're going to have the press conference. You can ask whatever questions you have, because otherwise we were getting bombarded with questions throughout the day from all the different media. So this way we established we're going to have a set press conference at this time on these days, and feel free to come and ask your questions.
And it takes up this much, it takes up a certain portion of your time instead of all of your time, right?
So I would suggest that the cities at least have a relationship with a media firm that they feel comfortable with ahead of time. So if something happens, that they can go to them. We are currently dealing with a situation has nothing to do with crime. I just said it was turned out that in our area, some of the water has a contaminant in it. And the local newspaper has made a big story of it, and we're having to respond, although we've been knowing about it for years and monitoring it for years and working with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and continuing to provide safe drinking water to our residents. But because of the newspaper article, residents are saying, whoa, wait a minute, is the water, it has this stuff in it. Well, yes, but not in a contaminated way, not in a fearful way, but we have hired a company to help us craft the story so that we're getting the message out as we should to the residents.
I think it does matter, and then somebody doesn't accidentally misspeak, or that's the issue. Is if you say it incorrectly, you can cause them some real problems. I love that thinking. Go ahead, Ryan.
Well, and I just want to point out, anyone who knows you, Norton, would know when you say craft a story, you mean it in the sense that you're seeking transparency and truth, and you want to get real messages to people. I believe that's what you mean, because
yes, exactly.
Because the media is going to be crafting things. They want to get watchers, they want to get people riled up oftentimes, and sometimes they're not 100% interested in the straight facts. And so you have to be very careful about how you present things so it
Brian, I'm
doesn't
glad you mentioned that. Yeah, what I'm talking about is getting accurate information out. Yeah, when I'm
right.
saying crafting it is getting accurate information out and knowing how to do that, whether it's through social media, press releases, etc. But the city getting accurate information out so that the residents get that and not just rely on social media or press or newspapers in terms of hearing something or from their neighbors. I had a neighbor stop me and say, my wife is thinking about getting a reverse osmosis machine for our water because she's seeing that the water's not safe. And I said, well, I can't tell you what to do, but I'll tell you that I'm not going to get that. I'm fine drinking the city water.
That's a beautiful message. And then one of the things you've talked about having an emergency plan,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd love to just have your thoughts about, I presume you now have an emergency plan for civil unrest. And can you kind of like help us know, for other city leaders, what are some of the essential items that are in your emergency plan for civil unrest?
Well, it also combines with emergency plans dealing with hurricanes. For instance, if a hurricane has come, have an emergency plan so we know about the schools and contacting the schools so they make the shelters so that people that are in either homeless or experiencing homelessness or in trailers or in areas that may be affected by the hurricane, they may feel more comfortable going to a school that can serve as a shelter.
Sure.
So knowing who at the school district to call and having the meetings. One of the things we did even here in Seminole County with COVID is our emergency management plan for the county, the emergency management for the manager for the county would have weekly meetings with all the city managers and the school superintendent, the sheriff's office, the health department. So we're all talking together on the same. So in addition to the city, there are situations that happen that are countywide, like a hurricane.
Right, right.
So it's important to have communications so we are all working together. From a law enforcement perspective, we have an excellent relationship with our sheriff, as well as we do with the other surrounding police departments. So I think that that's part of the plan also, is to know who's who and to have established relationships with them. The city managers in Seminole County get together on a regular basis so we can do things. For instance, one of the challenges we had at one point was wastewater treatment plants. Well, if you have no operator or the operator is sick, how do we, or if there's a shortage of operators, being able to call on each other to help pitch in emergency situations. So when you say emergency, that can be everything from a hurricane,
Right.
tornado, to a shooting, to you name it.
Well, and I think most cities will have an emergency plan, but it sounds like they should take their emergency plan and rethink it about what it would be if you have civil unrest.
Exactly, because
Right.
that's
And you
that's
just
what's
you
been
just
missing.
yeah, you just overlay. You don't create a separate plan. You
Right,
just overlay on top of that plan. All right, here's some things we probably haven't been thinking about.
right.
And
And
I
then
love
action
that.
for that. And the one I'll point out again is making sure you're establishing relationships with the various community leaders so that if something happens, again, if something happens like in Pulse, in Orlando, we had the Pulse shooting, which was devastating. But then who do you know that you can connect with in the LBTG community and that you already have an established relationship with? I mean, that's the main thing. It's
I
establishing
love it.
relationships, identifying the communities, identifying who the relationship leaders are, and then building those.
Norton, this has been just a pure delight.
Well, thank you, Ron.
Do you have
I
anything
agree.
you'd like to share in conclusion at all? Anything more?
I'm blessed to be doing what I want to do when I grow up, so I appreciate this. And the idea is it's not so much what happened in Sanford, is what others can learn from what happened in Sanford. Because
I
you're right,
agree.
Brian. Anything can happen. Like I said, you can have something that takes place in the city that the city has no control over, was not involved with, but all of a sudden thrust the city in some light that the city government is called upon to manage.
Right. No, that's really good.
And
Well,
it's a
thank you.
beautiful takeaway that relationships are the key to preparedness. I think that's true for a city as well as our personal lives too. There's nothing
Absolutely.
better to have than a good friend when things go poorly. So thanks for sharing, Norton.
So, Ryan, you're absolutely correct. So, all right.
All righty. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you found this discussion valuable, please consider subscribing and sharing with others. If you have a topic or question you'd like to hear us discuss in our next episode, leave a comment or send us an email. It's podcast@ onpoint-insights.com. See you next time.